Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review Jane Eyre. So this is the 2011 version. I'm sure there probably is another variation of this movie that is probably be free on YouTube right now, but I went on and stubbornly watched the 2011 version regardless. So, with that said, this movie is actually based off of a book from what I read on Wikipedia. So, because heaven forbid I crack open a book, right? But I went on and I was recommended this movie by a another person who is to do YouTube videos called Nymheria, and I went on and I actually did really enjoy this movie. It has this kind of like Cinderella kind of tale that eventually is to kind of everything is to possibly work out in the end. There is kind of two stories going on in this film where I kind of got confused. Or there is some moments where you're to go on and figure out what is to happen with this movie. The further and further it goes, to just be like, oh, like that might lead to some of the mystery that is kind of going on in this film. Oh, okay, that may make a little bit more sense here. The only thing that I got a little confused about is when they would go on and kind of break down certain family members that are to go on and like bring letters or do this and that. Like some of the dialogue or some of the times when there was like too many people all being said or being in the room all at once, the movie got a little confusing to me. But other than that, like I really did enjoy this movie, even though I felt at some points not as smart as to easily break down some of the dialogue, but it is what it is. So, with that said, what is this movie about? So, this movie, of course, is to be about Jane, and so Jane is to become an orphan because her parents are to do this thing called die. So, Jane is to end up with her aunt, Miss Reed, at her place, and eventually Miss Reed is to, one way or another, just get really irritated with this girl to where she's just like, dude, take her. Take her away. Frickin' put her in a school somewhere. Like, get rid of her. Like, I just don't like this woman. So Jane is to go to school, seemingly forever, until she becomes like the age of which to then decide to go off and immediately go and find work, find a job, because she doesn't definitely want to go back to the Reed family. She wants to go on and just go and transition elsewhere. So Jane eventually in this movie is to do two different stories. So Jane is to also be with St. John Rivers and is to be with his two sisters and eventually have Jane be with these people until she's to find a job working at a school, as well as Jane is to also make her way in to working with a guy named Rochester, who is played by Michael Fassbender, who she is supposed to take care of his daughter from an estranged marriage. It seems like this guy is to go on and get married a lot, let's just say, in this film. So we within this film are to eventually find Jane and Rochester to at some point be falling for one another as they are to save one another in some ways or another. And so certain kind of introductions of certain things are really interesting. To have at one point Rochester's character, who of course is to be introduced to Jane and not really think of who this guy really is. But then we turn around and it's like, aha, it's the same guy. So immediately there's just some like, yeah, I'm not quite sure I like this person yet, and I'm gonna figure out a way to like her, and then off to the races, so to speak, horse races. Anyways, so with that said, the grading of this film is, I thought it was good. Like, once we get past the first hour, I was very worried that I was not going to remember enough of this film, because I'm like, oh my god, once I got to the first hour, I'm like, oh my god, we're at the first only hour already. I'm like, there is so much going on. Oh my god, how am I gonna remember all this? So yeah, I'm gonna make the decision to cover all of the St. John River stuff. I'm going to cover all that at the end, so that way I can have a perfect flow of things. And then I'll cover like Jane being with Rochester and all of that stuff. I'll cover that in the early parts of it, because there's just a lot of that to cover. And then like the Jane St. John River stuff is kind of like the afterthought of a lot of the movie anyways. So with that said, going on, I think it's about that time to just go into spoilers. So let's double fire this bad boy up. I think it's about that time. Check this movie out if you would like to. Some people may like it. Some people may think that it's a long-winded film. At the end of the day, there's a plethora of different variations of this movie out there. So that should be an easy enough reason to see some variation of this movie, if not this one right here. So with that said, this movie is available on Stars right now, but I've also used a number of apps through a long stretch of time, which hopefully will help you to be able to watch anything that you would like for absolutely free. So with that said, I'm going to go on and rattle those off. So, going on to a Google search, I can have you search the word letter C movies. So one of these, C movies app. Currently right now, C movies app was to go on and get this update. And so once you go into that app and you download the update of it and go on to be into Yes Movies, you can go on and see whatever you like. There is also another app that I can recommend to people called Fox HD Movies. Regardless of what I say next, this may help or hinder you. Go on and find this app quicker. The logo will say Fox HD Movies. The title will say something different. It'll say Play 1080p HD Movies. Hopefully that'll be able to help you find this app somehow. And then there is a third app which I had gone on and seen this movie, so I can kind of hear it in subtitle. Hear it with subtitle, hear it in subtitle. So, going on, if you Google search the words TV Crush, 2 words, you should be able to go on and find a link for an app that is to be called like HD Movies, 1, 2, 3 Movies, something like that. You'll go and find a logo that says HD Movies, the king crown off the side, and go on and download that app and be able to watch not only this for absolutely free, but a number of other items that you wouldn't be able to go on and see anywhere else for absolutely free. Not everything, but a lot of things. You know what I'm saying? So with that said, I think it's about that time to just go into spoilers. By the way, a lot of times you could probably go on to a Google Play Store or whatever phone app that you probably have and be able to stumble upon a bootleg app. But I've just used the 3 of those for a long stretch of time, and even when they would change and tweak and be different, they would always work. So with that said, I'm going to get out of here and go on into spoilers. So let's double fire this bad boy up, because it's about that time to just go into what, of course, is be called spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time to get you spoiled this movie. So, in the very beginning of this film, I am again going to cover two different stories. So, the story of which that I want to cover first is Jane as a young kid running through her home with this book. We have Master Reed, who is John Reed, who is making his way through this home and threatening Jane that if she isn't going to be polite with him, he is going to have to like punish her. And so he's kind of like doing this like kind of like I'm gonna get you, like you better say that you apologize to me, Master Reed. And so he's kind of lurking through the place. So we have Jane who is hiding behind the this uh, kind of curtains that are to have this, I think, couch, and she's kind of poking through this book. So, wouldn't it be nice to just go on and just like open up some curtains and there'd be a couch there? Wouldn't that be sweet? Oh yeah, I just so happen to have like like a couch right there, just in case I needed one. So Jane goes on and is starting to poke through this book, and we, of course, have John Reed finding her, and he, of course, is to hurt her and get a little blood upon her face. Not blood, blood. And so Jane, of course, is to strike back, get on top of John, and start pelting him. And all of a sudden, the Reed family just comes in and like, "Oh my God, this girl is beating on John Reed! How dare she!" They didn't even realize like what led up to this whole thing. They're just like, no, this girl is throwing punches. How dare she? So Jane is to be taken into this room where she is to be put in this chair, I guess, for some kind of weird, goofy timeout. And so they're telling her to either sit in this chair or they're going to tie her in it. And so before they close this door, they tell Jane, it's like, well, yeah, you better hope that there's going to be something coming out of that chimney that is going to take you away from us, or something along those lines. All of a sudden, Jane is to be banging against this door, no, no, and all of a sudden, we have this soot that comes plopping out of this chimney, and she's like, oh no, something's coming. They were right. So Jane all of a sudden goes on to like smack her head against this door and falls over with blood still coming from her head. So Miss Reed, because she does not want to deal with Jane, because of course, like, well, this isn't really my kid, it's some other family member, and so, or some other family member's kid, so I just want to figure out a way to just get rid of her. She is just to be, like, unlike all the other ladies that are to be gentlemanly, or whatever the equivalent of gentlemanly is. Not popping in there. So, ladylike, there we go. Maybe? Yes. Score one for the... Anyways, pushing on. So, Miss Reed is to speak with a guy called Mr. Brocklehurst. Brocklehurst? And so Mr. Brocklehurst is to go on and mention to Miss Reed that, like, oh, like, he's gonna, like, scare her straight. He's gonna make sure that whatever is up with this girl, like, they're just gonna figure out a way to just get it out of her, and so on and so forth. So we have Miss Reed telling Mr. Brocklehurst that, hey, if Jane has any vacation coming from this school, have her just be at this school. Just whatever you just gotta do to just keep her there, just, just keep her there. So Mr. Brocklehurst is like, sure, like, yeah, easily I'll go on and just I'll keep her. So Jane then goes on to this school where, of course, she's to be wearing like a certain kind of gown that all the other children's are wearing. So we have at one point one of the teachers who is to notice one of these girls are to make a mistake. So this girl just takes this wooden stick and freaking flops this woman in the back. And so Jane is to go on and purposely drop what she was holding, and they're like, "Oh, we're gonna like we're gonna take care of a girl like you." So come to find out eventually through this time and Jane being in school, she has a girl who is also her friend named Hannah, I believe. So Jane is going on with Hannah, who I guess is to have dysentery, and so Jane's friend is to start fading, and Jane is to hold on to her and be kind of like Titanic, where it's like, I'll never let go, Jack, I'll never let go. And so I have Jane holding on to this girl who then is to die, sadly enough. And so Jane is to be holding this girl's hand and she falls asleep. So they take Jane and put her in another bed, and then they take this girl away because, of course, she has sadly passed away. And Jane is just so saddened that her friend was to pass. So Jane then goes on to, after the horrible years of this school, is to leave. And all the kids are like, oh my god, Jane's leaving. Oh, Jane, hey, Jane. High five, Jane. This isn't during that time period. Why are you high-fiving? That doesn't work here. It doesn't work. So Jane goes on and is walking out of the school like, yeah, like I'm getting the heck out of here. All of a sudden she's looking at one of these teachers and she gives them the evil eye like, yeah, I know what you did. And then she leaves. So instead of Jane going off to work or going off to like go back with the Reed family, she instead's like, I'm gonna go and find work somewhere. Like I'm gonna go on and find a job. So Jane is to be well educated enough to where she, of course, can go on and go to Thornsfield, and we, of course, have Miss Fairfax, who is to greet Jane Eyre. So we have Fairfax, who's going on and mentioning how she feels that this house like feels haunted at some points, that people that she's kind of hear voices or stuff like that. But Miss Fairfax is to also tell Jane that they are to be at a consistent state of cleaning, because they definitely don't want Rochester to come home and think like, hey, like why isn't my whole house clean? So they make sure that they go on and clean every bit of this, even to the point to where when the Ingrid people come in, Fairfax is to specifically like get like help from other areas to like come in there and make sure that the place is spotless. So we have Miss Fairfax, who is to have Jane go and meet up with a girl named Adele, who is a French girl, and Jane is to luckily speak French. Here's also the thing. Supposedly Rochester was to have Adele through a certain relationship that he had feelings that maybe this woman wasn't really, or that his daughter wasn't really his, because come to find out, Rochester found that the woman that he was with at that time was sleeping around and had an affair, and that's why Rochester left her, and but eventually was to like keep the kid with him, and like that's why he has this kid without a wife, it seems. Chewing up the word seems. So Rochester eventually is to come into fray, but we're now dealing with Adele here. So Adele is to make her way to this place and is to go on and mention about all of her accomplishments that she was to do, some singing and dancing, and that Jane and Fairfax are to watch on as Adele is going to do this performance. And so Jane is translating to Fairfax, letting her know that's like, hey, this girl wants to show you all of her accomplishments that she did in France. And so this girl starts singing and doing this kind of ballerina kind of like performance. And in Fairfax is to kind of turn to Jane. It's like, well, like I guess that's the French. Like I guess that. So or like something like that. It's like so. We go on and we have kind of people getting prepared for Rochester to eventually come to this place. So we have Fairfax going on and giving Jane busy work to do, because Jane is to go on and talk about how she's never met a man before, and like she's never been in that world, and like she doesn't know how she's going to um like be with a man. And Fairfax is just like, well, like what you need is some exercise and some fresh air. How about you go on and deliver these letters? So Jane makes her way to delivering these letters, and all of a sudden is to bump into this guy on horseback who is to get scared by this woman, and he ends up falling over. So, come to find out that this is Michael Fassbender's character, and Jane doesn't even realize that this guy is Rochester. So she's just kind of talking to him like she would talk to any man. So we have this horse who is to get scared, so it falls over and lands on Rochester's leg, and he is to tell the beast to get up. And so Rochester slides away to this place for him to sit, and so Rochester to tell Jane to go on and get his horse for him, and Jane gets closer and closer to the horse and gets kind of afraid. So Rochester just goes on and tells Jane, it's like, okay, like, well, like either way, like it's either the horse comes to me or I need to come to the horse. So Jane just goes on and picks Rochester up here, and they kind of limp on to have Rochester get back on his horse. And so we have Rochester mentioning to Jane on how this is like the dark woods, and for her to try to like be safe and so on and so forth, as he is to make his way back to his home. Again, not having Jane realize that this is Rochester, and kind of just talking to him like she would talk to anybody. So we have Jane who is to make her way back to home, and so make her way back to the place that she was eventually at, Thornfield. Blah, 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 blah. So now Jane is to meet up with Rochester. So Jane is to make her way into this room, and she's like, I hope that this wasn't the guy. And when Jane is to see this guy's face, she's like, oh crap. So Jane goes on and is to sit down and is to be fairly quiet. And so Rochester is just kind of thumbing through her sketches. And eventually he writes all the sketches off as being peculiar, even taking one of them out and giving it to Jane. And so the more and more Rochester is to talk to Jane, the more it seems that Jane is fairly unique in the way that she talks to him. And so Rochester is to go on and tell Jane, it's like, well, you know what? I've never heard of a girl like talk to me like this. Like, what's your tree of woe? Like, tell me your sob story. And Jane goes on and tells him that she was an orphan and that she lived at this home, and then she went to school and then came here. And so we have Rochester, who's just like, well, that's not really like a sad tale. And so the more and more Rochester tries to poke at this girl, the more like she doesn't really give in. And so Rochester is to say to Jane, it's like, you know what, like, you don't talk to me like any normal girl would. And Jane's like, well, that's because you don't know any normal girl. Obviously, like, they all like sound just like me. And Rochester's like, I'm liking this girl. Like, like, there's something about her. She doesn't. She like she's going to equally, when I'm giving her guff, she gives me guff back. So it's cool. So Rochester is to admit that after he goes on and gives his daughter a dress, and we had the funny moment where his daughter gets a dress and is to mention the exact same thing that her mother used to say to him. And Rochester goes on and says, like, yeah, and every time that she would say that, she would just get more money from my pocket. And then she leaves. And so, but Rochester is not really interested in his daughter, but it seems that he is to grow interested in Jane. And so the more and more we go on to this story, the more that these characters are to be like kind of just fascinated with one another. So Jane is then, after this whole thing is over between Jane and Rochester talking, we have Jane asking Mrs. Fairfax about Rochester. And so Fairfax is to mention that this guy is a good master. It's just the fact that sometimes he has ill humor. And so we have Rochester was going on and firing these shots, and we consistently have these girls kind of like jumping because they're like, what? Like, so Rochester is going on and just firing away. I guess there might have been a number of birds or a number of things that like Rochester just wanted to get rid of. Maybe squirrels or whatever around his home. So we go on into this film, and so Jane is to eventually spend more time with Adele, and she is to be showing Adele this picture, and is to talk about this beast. And Adele is to tell Jane about this story about this certain woman that is to be this bloodsucker. And so Adele and Jane are exchanging these stories. So we also go on and have Rochester wanting to go on and kind of throw this party of sorts. And so we have Rochester that is to invite the Ingrid family, or a number of Ingrid people, as it seems that Rochester is to be interested in one of them. I think it might be Blanchett. Blanchett Ingrid, um, and a number of the Ingrid family. So while they go on and bring all this family in, we are to also have Fairfax mention to Rochester about a guy who I believe is Richard Mason, who is to be coming from Jamaica to speak with Rochester. And so Rochester is to hug Richard Mason, and we never really see him again until later on in the night, where all of a sudden the Ingrids and everyone else inside this house are to hear this noise. So Rochester is to go on and find out where this sound was, like tell everybody like, hey, like keep calm everybody, like everything's gonna be fine. So Rochester is to go on and see that Richard Mason is to have a number of injuries on his body, and so Rochester is going on and asking for them to call for a doctor, and so Dr. Carter ends up coming in and taking care of Richard Mason. So we now have Jane, who has lost some trust with Rochester, because Jane is now asking Rochester, like, hey, like, where did this violence come from? Like, where did these injuries from this guy, like, how did they happen? And Rochester is unwilling to explain this to Jane. And so Jane is like, I'm not sure if I can trust this guy. But she's still going to take his money. Maybe not all of it, but she's going to take his money anyways. So we have the big turnaround within this tale where even though Jane doesn't really trust 100% Rochester, she still saves his life. So we have in this story where Jane one night is to hear this sound, and so Jane is to wake up. Jane is to make her way to Rochester's room and find out that the house, or that the room that Rochester is in, is caught on fire. Because when really thinking about it, when you have a house filled to the brim with candles, at some point something's gonna light on fire. And so yeah, with that I can completely understand why there were probably a number of people that died during early time periods simply because of candle accidents at some point. So Rochester is to be asleep, and when he wakes, he starts coughing because of all the smoke in the room. And so they grab this quilt and are smacking the flames out because it's not like you can call a fire department. Like luckily the flames weren't all that like massive to where it was like an uncontrolled thing where they couldn't like douse this flame out. So we have Rochester asking Jane, hey, why is it that you came for me? And Jane is like, well, I heard a sound. And so Rochester's like, Jane, you just saved my life. Like, I'm in your debt kind of thing. And Jane's like, well, there's no debt. Come on. Like, and Rochester's like, no, like, you don't understand that you just saved my life. You just saved my life, woman. So that is to just really like cement that Jane and of course Rochester are to go and have a possible relationship. So we have Miss Fairfax going on to Jane, and like talking about how Rochester is to be looking into jewelry and is to uh, be like singing some of the songs that he remembers this girl singing, and it seems that Rochester is happy. And so Jane, it seems, is to be very upset because if Jane wasn't, of course, when uh, Rochester was to have Ingrid come in and he was singing with her, and Jane was to immediately leave the room, stating that she was very tired. And Rochester's just asking Jane, it's like, hey, like, why did you leave the room? Like, I haven't spoken to you in a number of days. And so, like, why haven't you talked to me? Like, I wanted to talk to you. Why haven't you done this, the yibbity yab? And so Rochester keeps poking at Jane, and Jane won't really say anything. And so Rochester's just like, well, okay. So realizing that he knows what's wrong, but like he uh like wants her to say it. So Jane, after hearing Fairfax talking about how Rochester is going to get married and this and that, we just start to have Jane, that is really just interested at this point, to just leave. Like, she's like, I'm so done with this. Like, I want to get out of here. Let me go. Like, I'm done with this. So, come to find out, Jane is to hear word from her family. And so that's all the reasoning Jane really has to want to leave uh, Rochester, if not anything else. So we have Jane starting to leave to make it to her family's home because she is to have had letter about her family who is ill, and some of her family has died. And Miss Reed, I think, has had a heart attack. So Jane goes off, and so before Jane leaves, I think this is the point when Rochester goes on and is to tell Jane that like Ingrid is like means nothing to him, and that he loves Jane and wants to be with Jane. They kiss, and like as Jane is trying to get away from him, like Rochester's like, no, I love you, and they both kind of smooch and all this stuff to tell them that they're going to be together. So Jane and Rochester, like the relationship is working out so well that Rochester wants to marry Jane quickly. So we have both Jane and Rochester who get married to this clergyman. And so we have this clergyman that comes in, and we have Rochester quickly grabbing Jane and rushing to the altar, so to speak. And it seems that Rochester is very upset. He had gone on and talked to certain people, and now he is very upset. So Jane and Rochester try to get married, and one guy kind of barges in. He's like, I'm sorry, but I am going to object to this marriage because Rochester is to be married to Bertha Mason. And he is still married to her, so yeah, this marriage cannot happen. As this guy, I think his name is Briggs, is coming in, as if this is weirdly Lethal Weapon. Briggs! You guys ever see Lethal Weapon? I would recommend it, maybe, somewhat. So, Jane is to be like, well, what are you talking about? So, Come to find out, Rochester is to be having a secret that he has had for a long stretch of time. And so Rochester is to go on to show Jane that he had a wife named Bertha Mason that he has been keeping in his home that has lost her mind. She is mentally unwell. So Mirtha is going on and like being very like wild and crazed and whatever. And so Rochester, after he's showcasing his wife, Rochester is to mention that Bertha at some points is to have gone on and wanted to attempt escapes and want to fly out of a window and then go on and do all kinds of like things because she's mentally unwell. Rochester is to mention to Jane that he could not go on and send Bertha to a madhouse or a mental sane asylum, whatever it's called. But he says madhouse. He could not take her to a madhouse because it looked like people were caged and like treated like animals, and he could not go on and do something like that to her. So Rochester is to go on and tell Jane that he still loves her and he still wants them to go on as man and wife, even though they may not be able to get married. And Jane cannot do that. That is like the line that is drawn here. So Jane cannot do this, and so she has to leave, and it's kind of like ripping her arm off having to do this, but she cannot go and continue to be in love with Rochester, but cannot also marry him because of this woman who he is still technically married to, because it's just not right. So Jane, and here's the other back half of the story now, that kind of commingles within the story. So Jane is to finally one night leave Thornsville Field, and and then she is to leave one night and walk away from this place. Rochester is to find out she is missing one day, and is to be screaming out the window for Jane. Jane, Jane, where are you, Jane? So Rochester was to mention to Jane that if Jane is to leave him, like he will, like he'll, it feels like he will die, or he will, like be forever just like broken, because of Jane not being with him. But Jane just leaves anyways. Jane needs to do what Jane needs to do. So Jane goes on and leaves Rochester and starts just walking. Just starts walking in the rain, and Jane is to eventually just go into this house and start knocking away. So all of a sudden we have St. John's Rivers and his two sisters finding him, or finding Jane. That's a her. And they're just like, oh my god, like this girl, like is she dead? Like is she gonna make it? Like and they're like, I don't know, like let's get her some hot milk. And hot milk, right? Weird. Do people drink hot milk? I love cold beverages. I don't like hot cocoa. I don't like coffee. Like I like cold beverages. Like I don't usually ever really barely ever drink beer anymore, but like I always like something cold rather than hot. I'm just that kind of person. So, but they have hot milk that they give her. So I'd be thinking, out of all the things to give her, like milk, like if especially you're gonna get sick, I don't think milk would be the right thing to give this girl. But whatever. So, anyways, so once this girl seems to come to and she is rested and she's probably exhausted and a number of other things. So John Rivers is asking, St. John Rivers is asking Jane, like, hey, like, who are you? Where are you from? This and that, getting her backstory. So Jane goes on and tells them very little. And so Jane just continues to go on with these people and is to start sketching John Rivers. We also had the one scene where when Jane was to try to leave Rochester, she actually wasn't getting paid her full wage because Jane was to ask Rochester for money, and Rochester only had a 10 or a 50. And so when Rochester just gave Jane a 50, Jane is like, well, wait a minute, like, this is too much money. And Rochester's like, well, all I have is a 10. And Jane's like, fine, well, I'll take that, and then you'll just owe me. And Rochester's like, well, I'm going to keep this money, and I'm going to keep it safe. Like, you remind me that I have this money for you. And Jane's like, yeah, whatever. And so she goes off, finds John Rivers and her and his two sisters, sketches John Rivers, and so John Rivers is like, oh, like, you drew me, like this is what you think of me. All right, oh, cool. So we then go on and have Jane, who is talking to St. John Rivers, and he's like, well, hey, like, Jane, what do you want to do? Like where do you want to go? And Jane's like, well, I just want work. And St. John Rivers was like, well, like, it seems there's a possible job at this school. Like, would you be interested? And Jane's like, yeah, that would be perfect. And so St. John Rivers is like, are you sure? Like, so when Rivers is to give Jane this home that's like small and plain, like, Jane's to be completely fine with it. And then Rivers goes and is to get her into this school job, and she now goes on and does this school job. So at one point, Rivers is to find out that there was to be a number of people that died within her family, that it seems that Jane is now to be left with this massive fortune. Somehow this letter from, I believe, Miss Fairfax was to be given to John Rivers. So John Rivers is telling Jane, hey, yeah, you're rich now. Like, you have 20,000 pounds and you're rich. So what are you doing a teacher's job? Like, go on and be rich. And so Jane is going on and like, what? Like, as if somebody like stabbed her, and like she has this kind of like, instead of this like look of like, oh my god, I hit the jackpot, instead she's like, no, like, and so we also had Jane, who was to talk to Miss Reed, and evidently Miss Reed was hiding some note from Jane where one of her family members wanted to adopt Jane, and that was a letter that was 3 years old, and Miss Reed could have given this girl this letter, but she didn't. And so eventually they went on, and Jane was to come to this fortune, and so Jane was to tell John Rivers, it's like, well, hey, like, how about you and me, like, we be brothers and sisters? And so John Rivers is like, okay, that seems about right. Like that seems fine. So Jane is to go on and be with this family, and so what happens is that John Rivers wants to finally go on and tell Jane, it's like, well, hey, like, how about you finally settle down? How about you get married? How about you like marry me? And Jane is just like, no, like, I like you, but like not in that way. Like, I like you as a brother and nothing more than that. So all of a sudden, while Jane is to be talking to John Rivers about her possibly getting married to him and she has no interest, all of a sudden she is to want to run back from hearing something in her ears that sounds like Rochester. So Jane is all of a sudden running off to Thornville, and come to find out there was an accident in this place where Rochester had gone on and had another accident where a room of his had burst into flame, and it seemed that somehow within the story Bertha was to fly out and die, and we also had Rochester, who is to now be blind from what had happened. So Jane is to talk to Fairfax and mention that it's like, well, hey, like, why didn't you come to me? I could have given you money. Like, we have been like kind of really good friends, and I could have helped you, and I could have this, I could have that. And Jane is just like, no, like they liked one another, but like Jane just like wanted to do her own thing, wanted to go her own way. So Jane then goes on and is to meet back up with Rochester, and when Rochester is to like ask like who is there, realizing that now Rochester is blind, Rochester starts touching Jane's hand and is to touch Jane's face like, oh, Jane. And so we go on and have both Jane and Rochester technically picking up where they left off, where they're hugging one another, and that's how the movie just kind of ends, making us assume that Jane went back to Rochester, and they eventually were to go on and live happily ever after that. So, with that said, that covers hopefully most of this movie in a very roundabout way, maybe not perfect. There was probably some bajillion million other things that I probably should have said within this film, but I feel that I was also good enough because this movie is 2 hours in length, and I'm sure there's a billion trillion things that I forgot about because there is a lot to pull away from this film. Um, Plus, there's multiple different variations of Jane Eyre, so like not everything could probably be exactly the same in every single film. But with that said, I think I'm just gonna go on and try to get out of here because I feel if I go on and say anything else about this movie, it would just be like I don't know if this is part of the film, but blah 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 blah. So with that said, I think I'm gonna get out of here. Let me know in the comments below if there's something that I forgot about within this movie, because I'm sure I did. Let me know also in the comments below how you felt about this movie, if you were to go on and figure out a way to say that you could see this film, or see any of the other Jane variations out there that are probably for free on YouTube, or eventually wherever. Let me know in the comments below. Goodbye, everybody. Bye, buddy.